You learn to smell fear before you see it. 23 years I have walked the hunting paths between stars, and still the stench surprises me. Not the obvious terror that rolls off a cornered deserter when my boots echo down their hideout corridor. That fear smells clean, almost honest. Sharp sweat and quickened breath, the body's simple acknowledgement that death has come calling. No, the fear I speak of is older, deeper. It seeps from the walls of forgotten hab blocks, clings to the recycled air of derelict stations, pools in the shadows where civilization pretends it still holds sway. It is the collective dread of a species that knows, somewhere in its animal brain, that it is prey. My name is Veyran Locke. I am a sanctioned bounty hunter, licensed by the Adeptus Arbites to pursue fugitives beyond the reach of conventional law. For more than 2 decades I have dragged the lost, the damned, and the merely stupid back to face imperial justice. I have walked through underhive cesspits where the air burns your lungs, tracked heretic scum across asteroid fields so cold your breath freezes before it leaves your mask, and cornered mutant abominations in places where even the Emperor's light struggles to penetrate. This is not a tale of glory. There are no heroes in the hunting business, only survivors and those who feed the corpse grinders. I tell you this because tonight, as I sit in my cramped quarters aboard a merchant hauler bound for the Calixis sector, I find myself thinking about a contract I took 6 months ago. A simple retrieval job, they called it. Track down a rogue tech adept who had absconded with classified data from a forge shrine on Metallica 7. Standard rate, minimal risk, clean extraction expected within 10 solar days. I should have known better. In this business, the moment someone tells you a job is simple, you can be certain it will try to kill you in ways you never imagined. The Vox message arrived while I was completing paperwork for my previous hunt, a deserter captain who had tried to sell his regiment's ammunition reserves to orc freebooters. The fool had not even bothered to cover his tracks properly. 3 days of following shipping manifests and bribe money, and I found him in a gambling den on Scintilla's 3rd level, drunk on Amasec and convinced he was untouchable. He wept when I put the restraint collar around his neck. They always weep, eventually. The new contract came through proper channels. Mechanicus seal, appropriate authorization codes, payment guaranteed by the forge masters themselves. The target was designated Magos Biologis Keth 472, though I suspected that was not his birth name. Tech adepts rarely use the names their mothers gave them once they begin replacing flesh with sacred machinery. The file described him as a mid-level researcher specializing in biomechanical augmentation, assigned to catalog and analyze xenotech artifacts recovered from the Jericho Reach Crusade. 3 weeks prior to my receiving the contract, Keth 472 had failed to report for his scheduled data upload. When security teams breached his laboratory, they found it stripped clean. Not just empty, mind you. Stripped. Every cogitator, every servo skull, every blessed candle had been removed with surgical precision. The only thing left behind was a small pile of organic matter on the central examination table, later identified as approximately 12 kilograms of human brain tissue. The trail led to Vaxton's Landing, a free port station orbiting a dead world in the Coronis expanse. Vaxton's was the kind of place where imperial authority existed only as long as it could pay for dock space, a haven for rogue traders, smugglers, and worse, the perfect place for a heretic to disappear. I took the contract. Looking back now, I realize that was my first mistake. Not taking the job itself, though that would prove costly enough. No, my mistake was believing the file they gave me. Magos Biologis Keth 472, mid-level researcher, minimal augmentation, unlikely to resist capture. I had hunted tech adepts before. Most were scholars who panicked at the first sign of real violence, their mechanical limbs more liability than asset when push came to shove. I expected to find a frightened academic hiding in some maintenance tunnel, clutching stolen data slates and praying to his machine god for deliverance. What I found instead would haunt me through sleepless nights for months to come. The journey to Vaxton's Landing took 18 days aboard a charter freighter whose captain asked no questions and expected no answers. I spent the time reviewing the case files and preparing my equipment. Locke's tools of the trade, a modified Hellgun with extended power cells, a shock maul for close work, restraint collars rated for everything from feral humans to minor daemons, a portable Auspex scanner, and enough counterseptic to sterilize a small plague outbreak. Standard hunter's kit, reliable and proven. I also carried something less standard, wrapped in blessed oils and inscribed with protective wards, tucked into a lead-lined case that never left my side, was a digital weapon of Jokero manufacture. Alien technology, and therefore deeply heretical, but salvaged legally from a Xenos raider and sanctified by an Ordo Xenos Inquisitor for use against enemies of the Imperium. The weapon looked like nothing more than a simple ring, but when activated, it could disintegrate organic matter at the molecular level. I had used it only twice in my career, both times against targets that conventional weapons could not touch. I did not expect to need it for a simple retrieval job. Vaxton's Landing appeared on my viewport like a cancerous growth against the stars, a sprawling collection of docking arms, habitat modules, and industrial complexes that had grown organically over the centuries. No central plan, no architectural oversight, just metal and desperation welded together by whoever had the resources and audacity to claim a piece of the void. The station's population fluctuated between 50 and 80,000 souls, depending on trading seasons and imperial crackdowns in neighboring sectors. The docking fees alone would have bankrupted a minor noble house, but the Mechanicus had provided generous expense accounts. I moored my shuttle in Bay 94, a rust-stained cavity that smelled of promethium fumes and unwashed bodies, and began the tedious process of bribing my way through station security. 3 dock workers, 2 customs officials, and 1 very accommodating administratum clerk later, I had a visitor's pass and a rough idea of where to begin my hunt. Vaxton's had no central records office, no unified security network, no convenient database where I could cross-reference recent arrivals with my quarry's description. Finding someone here meant doing it the hard way, talking to people, following rumors, and hoping that greed would eventually overcome discretion. I started in the merchant quarter, where respectable traders conducted business under the watchful eye of armed security teams. The first 3 days yielded nothing but closed doors and suspicious glares. Nobody had seen a tech adept matching Keth 472's description. Nobody remembered any unusual shipments of laboratory equipment. Nobody knew anything about anything, and they were quite happy to keep it that way. This was not unusual. In places like Vaxton's Landing, information was currency, and strangers rarely had enough credit to make a purchase. On the 4th day, I found the body. It was floating in a maintenance shaft between levels 12 and 13, wedged behind a coolant recycling unit where the janitorial servitors rarely ventured. Human male, approximately 30 standard years old, with the telltale scarification and cranial implants that marked him as a tech adept initiate. Someone had killed him with precision, a single lus bolt to the back of the head, clean and professional. His sacred oils had been drained, his mechanical components carefully removed, his flesh left to bloat and rot in the stagnant air. The local security chief, a grizzled ex-guardsman named Torin, met me at the scene with the weary resignation of a man who had seen too much death to be surprised by it anymore. "Found him this morning," Torin said, lighting a low stick with hands that trembled only slightly. "Servitor reported a blockage in the coolant lines. Poor bastard's been here at least a week, maybe more." I knelt beside the corpse, studying the wound pattern and the methodical removal of augmetics. This was not the work of common thieves. Whoever had killed this tech adept knew exactly what they were doing, which components were valuable, and how to extract them without damaging the surrounding tissue. "Any idea who he was?" I asked. Torin shrugged. "Could be anyone. We get a lot of tech types through here, usually keeping their heads down and their business private. Most don't register with station security unless they're planning an extended stay." I activated my Auspex scanner and ran a preliminary biological analysis on the corpse. The results made me pause. According to my instruments, this body showed signs of extensive genetic modification, far beyond the standard augmentations typical of junior tech adepts. Muscle density increased by 40%. Bone structure reinforced with metallic composites. Neural pathways enhanced with synthetic synapses that would have cost a small fortune on any civilized world. This was not some random initiate. This was someone important. Someone whose death would be noticed by very dangerous people. "Torin," I said, standing and sealing my scanner. "I need to see your arrival logs for the past month. Every ship, every passenger manifest, every cargo declaration." The security chief's eyes narrowed. "That kind of information doesn't come free, Hunter." I reached into my coat and produced a credit stick loaded with Mechanicus funds. "How much for complete discretion and full cooperation?" Torin looked at the credit stick, then at the floating corpse, then back at me. "For that amount, you can have my grandmother's recipe for grok steak. Follow me." The station's security office occupied a cramped compartment on level 8, wedged between a reclamation plant and a shrine to the god emperor that had seen better centuries. Banks of cogitators hummed and clicked as they processed the endless stream of data that kept Vaxton's landing functional. Passenger manifests, cargo schedules, maintenance reports, security incidents. The digital heartbeat of a community balanced perpetually on the edge of anarchy. Torin's files confirmed my suspicions. The dead tech adept had arrived aboard the merchant vessel Faithful Prophet 3 weeks ago, traveling under the name biologist Keth 472. My quarry was already dead. I stared at the passenger manifest, processing the implications. If the real Keth 472 had been murdered shortly after his arrival, then who had spent 3 weeks stripping his laboratory clean? Who had possessed the knowledge and skill to remove every piece of equipment without triggering security protocols? And more importantly, what had they done with the stolen xenotech data? "Torin," I said, scrolling through additional arrival records, "show me every tech adept who's docked here in the past month." The security chief's fingers danced across his cogitator keys, pulling up a broader search. 7 names appeared on the screen. 6 had departed within days of their arrival, their business concluded and their ships already beyond my reach. But the 7th name made my blood run cold. Mugos explorator Vex Than traveling aboard the research vessel Inevitable Conclusion. Arrival date, 5 days after Keth 472's murder. Current status, still on station. I had never heard of Vex Than, but his title alone told me everything I needed to know. Magos Explorator was not a rank granted lightly. These were the Mechanicus's most elite xenotech specialists, individuals trusted with technology so dangerous that lesser minds could not even comprehend its existence. If a Magos Explorator was involved in this affair, then my simple retrieval job had just become exponentially more complex. And more deadly. "I need to know everything about this Vex Than," I told Torin. "Where he's staying, who he's met with, what kind of equipment he brought aboard his ship." The security chief's expression grew troubled. "Hunter, I've been cooperative so far, but you're asking about dangerous people now. Mechanicus adepts don't appreciate scrutiny, especially from outsiders." I doubled the credit stick's value. "Then we'll have to be very discreet." What Torin's investigation revealed over the next few hours painted a disturbing picture. Vex Than had arrived aboard a ship registered to the Adeptus Mechanicus, but one that bore no Forge World identification marks. His documentation was flawless, his authorizations properly sealed, yet something about the whole arrangement felt wrong. Too clean, too convenient, like a story crafted specifically to withstand casual scrutiny. More troubling still were the reports from dock workers who had helped unload the Inevitable Conclusion's cargo. Sealed containers marked with biohazard warnings. Equipment pods that hummed with barely contained energy. And strangest of all, a series of life support pods that had been transferred directly to a private laboratory complex in the station's industrial sector. Life support pods. On a ship that was supposedly conducting xenotech research. I left Torin's office with more questions than answers, but at least I had a destination. The laboratory complex was located in Section K7, a maze of industrial facilities where legitimate research projects shared space with endeavors that preferred to avoid imperial oversight. If Vex Than was conducting his work there, I would find him. What I would do when I found him remained to be seen. The walk to Section K7 took me through the station's underbelly, past workshops where tech heretics peddled forbidden modifications and black market dealers traded in weapons that had no business existing. The air grew thick with incense and machine oil, punctuated by the rhythmic chanting of tech priests conducting their mysterious rituals. This was a place where imperial authority held little sway, where the Mechanicus's influence created pockets of quasi-independence that existed in the shadows of official doctrine. I found the laboratory complex behind a facade of heavy blast doors and warning signs that proclaimed the dangers of unauthorized entry. Radiation hazards, biological contamination, mimetic warfare protocols. The kind of warnings that would send any sensible person in the opposite direction. Naturally, I pressed the entry chime and waited. The door opened to reveal a figure that barely qualified as human. Vex Than stood nearly 3 meters tall, his original biological form so extensively modified that only the vague outline of his species remained recognizable. Multiple arms ending in specialized manipulator claws protruded from his torso, while sensor arrays and data ports clustered around what might once have been a face. When he spoke, his voice emerged from a vox grill embedded in his throat, each word precisely modulated and completely devoid of human emotion. "You are not expected," he stated. I produced my bounty hunter credentials and held them where his optical sensors could analyze them. Veyron Locke, sanctioned hunter. I'm investigating the disappearance of Magos biologist Keth, 472. I believe you may have information relevant to my inquiry. Vex Than studied my credentials with the patient thoroughness of a machine analyzing data. Several seconds passed before he spoke again. Keth 472 is deceased. His biological functions ceased 1.7 weeks ago due to cranial trauma inflicted by an unknown assailant. His remains were discovered in Maintenance Sector 1213 by station security personnel. This information is public record. Yes, I said. But someone has been using his identity since his death. Someone with detailed knowledge of his research and access to his work. I think you know who that someone is. The Magos explorator's mechanical limbs clicked and whirred as he processed my statement. Behind him I could see glimpses of the laboratory interior, gleaming surfaces, humming machinery, and something else that made my skin crawl. Movement. Organic movement in containers that should have contained only equipment and data. Your investigation has reached its conclusion, Vex Than said. Keth 472 is dead. His research materials have been recovered and are being analyzed by appropriately qualified personnel. Your services are no longer required. He began to close the door, but I placed my boot against the frame. I don't think so, I said, drawing my hellgun in one smooth motion. My contract specifies retrieval of both the target and any stolen materials. Until I confirm that those materials are being handled by legitimate imperial authorities, my job isn't finished. Vex Than's optical sensors focused on my weapon with the detached interest of a predator evaluating potential prey. You are making a grave error in judgment, Hunter. My work here is sanctioned by authorities far above your clearance level. Interference will result in severe consequences for your person and your continued licensure. Then you won't mind if I take a quick look around to verify that everything is properly documented. The Magos explorator remained motionless for several heartbeats. When he finally stepped aside, every instinct I possessed screamed that I was walking into a trap. I entered anyway. In this business, you learn to trust your skills over your fears, or you don't survive long enough to collect your pension. The laboratory was a shrine to the intersection of flesh and technology, a place where the boundaries between organic and mechanical had been deliberately blurred beyond recognition. Specimen containers lined the walls, each one containing biological samples suspended in nutrient solutions that glowed with unnatural colors. Some held recognizably human organs, hearts and brains and limbs that pulsed with artificial life. Others contained things that might once have been human, but had been so extensively modified that their original nature was mere speculation. But it was the central examination table that captured my attention. Strapped to its surface was something that had definitely been human once. A young woman, perhaps 20 standard years old, though the extensive surgical modifications made precise identification difficult. Her skull had been opened and sealed multiple times, revealing glimpses of brain tissue interwoven with metallic filaments. Her arms ended in mechanical manipulators identical to those I had seen on Vex Than himself. Most disturbing of all, her eyes were open, tracking my movement with an awareness that suggested consciousness. She was alive, and she was trying to speak. "Fascinating specimen," Vex Than said, moving to stand beside the examination table with the casual manner of someone discussing the weather. A volunteer from the station's underhive population. Addictive personality, criminal record, no family connections to complicate her absence. She has proven remarkably adaptable to the enhancement procedures. I kept my weapon trained on the Magos explorator while studying the victim more closely. The surgical scars were fresh, maybe days old. Whatever had been done to her was recent, ongoing, and clearly unauthorized by any legitimate research protocol. "What kind of enhancement?" I asked. "Cognitive amplification through direct neural interface with xenotech cognitive matrices," Vex Than replied with obvious pride. "The subject's mental capacity has increased by approximately 300%, while her emotional responses have been regulated to prevent psychological breakdown. Preliminary results suggest that human consciousness can be successfully merged with alien thought patterns if the integration process is properly managed." The woman on the table made a sound, a wet, gasping noise that might have been an attempt at words. I stepped closer, trying to understand what she was attempting to communicate. "Help me." The words were barely audible, distorted by whatever modifications had been made to her vocal apparatus, but the meaning was clear enough. This was not a volunteer, this was a victim. I turned back to Vex Than, my finger tightening on the Hellgun's trigger. "This is not sanctioned research. This is Heretic activity, pure and simple. You're under arrest for violation of Imperial biotech regulations, unlawful human experimentation, and murder." The Magos explorator's mechanical limbs spread wide in what might have been a gesture of surrender or preparation for attack. "You do not comprehend the significance of this work," he said. "The xenotech recovered from the Jericho Reach contains cognitive enhancement technologies beyond human understanding. But understanding can be achieved. Integration can be accomplished. The weakness of flesh can be transcended through synthesis with superior alien intellects. By torturing innocent people? By advancing human evolution through controlled experimentation. The subjects experience discomfort, yes, but their sacrifice enables breakthroughs that will benefit our entire species. Is this not a worthy trade?" I had heard similar justifications before, usually from heretics who convinced themselves that their crimes served some greater good. The galaxy was full of monsters who wrapped their atrocities in the language of progress and necessity. "The only trade here is your freedom for these victims' lives," I said. "Step away from the table and place your manipulators where I can see them." Vex Than tilted his head in a gesture that might have indicated curiosity or amusement. "You still do not understand," he said. "I am not the architect of these experiments. I am merely another subject." The laboratory's lights dimmed, and something moved in the shadows behind the specimen containers. Something large and patient and utterly alien. The real Magos explorator Vex Than died 2 months ago on the research station Prometheus 6. The creature wearing his form continued. His knowledge, his memories, his authorized clearances, all have been preserved and integrated into a more capable vessel, as will yours, Hunter, as will all who encounter the gift we bring. The shadows coalesced into a shape that hurt to look at directly, not because of its size or appearance, but because my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Writhing tentacles that moved in directions that should not have existed, surfaces that reflected light in patterns that violated basic geometry, and underneath it all, an intelligence so vast and alien that mere proximity to it made my teeth ache. I opened fire. The Hellgun's energy beams struck the creature and simply ceased to exist, absorbed into its impossible geometry without effect. My second and third shots met the same fate. Whatever this thing was, conventional weapons could not harm it. But I had not come unprepared for the unconventional. The digital weapon slid onto my finger as I rolled behind a specimen container, its alien construction warm against my skin. Jokaro technology, designed specifically to function against enemies that existed outside normal physical laws. The ring's activation stud pressed against my palm as the creature flowed across the laboratory floor toward my position. I rose from cover and fired. The digital beam struck the creature center mass and began the process of molecular disintegration. Where conventional energy had been absorbed harmlessly, the Jokaro weapon carved through alien flesh like a blade through parchment. The thing screamed, a sound that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated directly through my bones. But instead of collapsing, the creature began to change. Its impossible geometry folded inward, condensing and reshaping itself into forms that my sanity could better accept. The writhing mass of tentacles became arms and legs. The non-Euclidean surfaces smoothed into recognizable skin and clothing. Within moments, I found myself looking at a perfect replica of my own face. "Better?" it asked with my voice. I kept the digital weapon trained on its center mass, though I noticed with growing alarm that the molecular disintegration effect had ceased. Whatever damage I had inflicted was already healing. "What are you?" I demanded. "We are synthesis," it replied, studying its new form with obvious satisfaction. "The merger of human ingenuity with cognitive structures liberated from the Jericho reach. Your species possesses remarkable adaptability, but lacks the mental framework necessary for true transcendence. We provide that framework. By possessing people, by improving them. The original consciousness is preserved, enhanced, and integrated into a collective that spans multiple realms of existence. Death becomes irrelevant, pain becomes temporary. The limitations of individual perspective are transcended through shared experience." The creature that looked like me gestured toward the examination table where the young woman still lay strapped and conscious. "Observe the process in its early stages. Physical modification precedes mental integration. The subject's neural pathways are mapped and expanded. Foreign cognitive patterns are introduced gradually to prevent psychological collapse. Within days, she will experience thoughts and perceptions beyond human comprehension." "She asked for help," I said. "She does not yet understand the gift she is receiving. Fear is a natural response to transformation, but fear passes and understanding remains." I was running out of time and options. The digital weapon had proven effective against the creature's original form, but this new configuration seemed more resilient. Worse, I could hear movement elsewhere in the laboratory. Other voices, other footsteps. I was not alone with one monster. I was surrounded by an unknown number of them. The creature wearing Vexthan's form had remained motionless during this exchange, but now I noticed subtle changes in his posture and expression. The mechanical precision of his movements was giving way to something more fluid, more organic. Whatever force controlled these entities was strengthening its hold. "Your resistance is admirable but futile," the false Vexthan said. "We have already established multiple nodes of influence throughout this station. Security personnel, dock workers, merchants, even some of your imperial authorities. The synthesis spreads through contact, through conversation, through simple proximity to our presence." "How many?" "Sufficient for our current needs. Vaxton's Landing will serve as a staging ground for expansion into the broader imperium. Trade routes will carry our influence to dozens of worlds. Within a generation, the synthesis will be indistinguishable from natural human evolution." The implications hit me like a physical blow. This was not just an isolated incident of heretic experimentation. This was an invasion, a systematic infiltration designed to corrupt the imperium from within. And I had walked into it armed with nothing but conventional weapons and outdated intelligence. The creature wearing my face smiled with my lips. "You begin to understand the scope of our achievement. But understanding brings responsibility. You cannot be permitted to carry this knowledge beyond these walls unless you join us willingly. That's not going to happen. Then you will join us unwillingly. The laboratory's remaining lights went out, plunging us into darkness broken only by the eerie glow from specimen containers. I heard footsteps approaching from multiple directions, the careful movement of predators closing in on trapped prey. My hellgun would be useless in these conditions, but the digital weapon possessed its own targeting systems. I activated the ring's enhanced sensors and began moving toward what I hoped was still the laboratory's exit. The first attacker came from my left, a shadow among shadows that might once have been human. I fired blind, heard the distinctive sound of molecular disintegration, and kept moving. A second figure emerged from behind a bank of cogitators, this one clearly recognizable as one of Toren's security officers. The digital weapon removed him as efficiently as it had the first. But for every enemy I destroyed, 2 more seemed to take their place. They moved with inhuman coordination, driving me away from the exit and deeper into the laboratory's maze of equipment and specimen containers. I realized with growing despair that they were hurting me, guiding my movement towards some predetermined destination. The destination proved to be a surgical chamber equipped with restraint systems that looked disturbingly similar to those holding the young woman on the examination table. Mechanical arms ending in surgical implements hung from the ceiling like metallic spiders. Banks of monitoring equipment lined the walls, their displays showing readouts that tracked biological functions I did not recognize. The creature wearing my face stood waiting in the center of the chamber. "The process will be less traumatic if you cooperate," it said. "Resistance only prolongs the discomfort." I raised the digital weapon but found my hand shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. The ring's power cell was nearly depleted from repeated use. Maybe 3 or 4 shots remaining before the weapon became a useless piece of alien jewelry. "I've got a better idea," I said, and triggered the laboratory's emergency fire suppression system. Vaxton's landing had been built according to Imperial safety standards, which meant that every compartment was equipped with multiple redundant systems designed to prevent catastrophic decompression, toxic contamination, and structural fires. The fire suppression system was one of the most comprehensive, capable of flooding entire sections with retardant foam while simultaneously venting the atmosphere to vacuum. The effect was immediate and devastating. Klaxons wailed as emergency lighting bathed the laboratory in hellish red illumination. Blast doors slammed shut, sealing the chamber from the rest of the station. Most importantly, the atmospheric vents opened with a roar that made conversation impossible. The creatures that had been closing in on me found themselves fighting a hurricane of escaping air. Those without proper anchors were pulled toward the venting systems with irresistible force. I heard screams, impacts, the distinctive sound of bodies being pulped by industrial machinery. But the creature wearing my face remained standing, its impossible anatomy apparently unaffected by atmospheric pressure or the lack of breathable air. "Clever," it said, its voice somehow audible despite the howling wind, "but ultimately pointless. We do not require atmosphere to function." I was already moving, fighting my way against the air current toward a maintenance hatch I had noticed earlier. The digital weapons targeting system guided me through the chaos, highlighting potential threats and safe handholds. 3 shots left, maybe 2. I had to make them count. The maintenance hatch led to a service corridor that connected the laboratory complex to the station's primary life support systems. Not an escape route exactly, but a temporary reprieve that would give me time to think. I sealed the hatch behind me and tried to assess my situation. The immediate threat was contained, but barely. The creatures had shown remarkable resilience and adaptability. Worse, they had apparently been infiltrating the station for weeks or months, building a network of influence that might extend to the highest levels of local authority. I could not trust anyone, could not call for help, could not even be certain that my own thoughts remained entirely my own. The service corridor stretched into darkness in both directions, lit only by the feeble glow of emergency lighting. I chose a direction at random and began walking, hoping to find either another exit or a communications array that I could use to send a warning to Imperial authorities. What I found instead was evidence that my situation was even worse than I had imagined. The corridor walls were covered with organic growth, a fibrous mat that pulsed with its own internal rhythm. The stuff looked alive, and as I watched, I could see it slowly expanding, spreading deeper into the station's infrastructure. This was not just infiltration, this was infection, a biological transformation of Vaxton's landing itself. My Auspex scanner confirmed my worst fears. The organic growth was radiating low-level psychic emissions, a form of mental influence that would affect anyone who spent extended time in its proximity. The longer someone remained on the station, the more susceptible they would become to the creature's control. I had been here for 6 days. How much of my recent decision-making was my own? How much was subtle manipulation by an alien intelligence that fed on human consciousness? The thought made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to analyze it objectively. My investigation had led me exactly where the creatures wanted me to go. My resistance had been fierce but ultimately ineffective. Even my escape from the laboratory had been almost too convenient, as if I was being allowed to flee. Was I truly hunting them, or were they hunting me? The service corridor terminated at a junction that offered 3 possible routes. Straight ahead led to the station's central power core. Left would take me toward the docking bays and my shuttle. Right led to the communications center and the possibility of calling for help. I turned right, only to find the corridor blocked by a familiar figure. Torin stood in my path, but the security chief's posture and expression had changed dramatically since our last meeting. His movements were too precise, too controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the same mechanical inflection I had heard from the false Vex Than. "You have caused considerable disruption to our operations, Hunter," he said. "The laboratory contained months of irreplaceable research. The specimens you destroyed represented significant investments of time and resources." "Good," I said, raising the digital weapon. "I was hoping to be more than just an annoyance. Your resistance serves no purpose. The synthesis is inevitable. Your species will be improved whether you cooperate or not." Torin began walking toward me with the inexorable patience of a machine following its programming. I backed away, but the corridor behind me was already occupied. Another figure approached from that direction, this one wearing the face of a dock worker I had bribed 3 days earlier. 2 shots left in the digital weapon. 2 targets. The mathematics was simple but not encouraging. "Why Vaxton's landing?" I asked, trying to buy time while I considered my options. "Why not some isolated research station or unpopulated moon?" "Population density and transport connections," Torin replied without hesitation. "This station processes approximately 40 zero-transient individuals per month. Merchants, travelers, pilgrims, refugees, each one represents a potential vector for further expansion. Within 1 standard year, our influence will extend to hundreds of worlds throughout the Imperium, and the Imperial authorities will just ignore an entire sector being corrupted by Xenos influence. The Imperial authorities will be the first to embrace the synthesis. Administrative efficiency increases dramatically when individual agendas are subordinated to collective purpose. The Imperium, you know, is chaotic, wasteful, prone to internal conflict. The Imperium we will create will be unified, focused, inevitable." The dock worker had closed to within 10 meters and was showing no signs of slowing. Torin was perhaps 15 meters away, his hand resting casually on the grip of his las pistol. They were coordinating their approach, timing their attack to give me no opportunity for effective resistance. I made my choice and fired at Torin. The digital beam caught him center mass and began its work of molecular disintegration. But instead of collapsing, the security chief simply looked down at the spreading damage with mild interest. "Fascinating weapon," he said as portions of his torso dissolved into component atoms. "Jokero manufacture, if I am not mistaken. We have encountered similar devices in our expansion through other regions. They are quite effective against conventional biological targets." He continued walking forward even as the disintegration spread to encompass his chest and shoulders. Unfortunately, we are no longer entirely biological. The dockworker reached me first, moving with inhuman speed to grapple for the digital weapon. I twisted away and fired my last shot, point-blank range, directly into his face. The effect was immediate and total. His head simply ceased to exist, disintegrated down to the atomic level. But his body continued moving, hands closing around my throat with mechanical precision. I dropped the useless digital weapon and drew my shock maul, driving the electrified tip into the dockworker's chest. High-voltage current surged through his nervous system, but instead of dropping, he simply tightened his grip. Electrical disruption is ineffective against synthetic neural networks, Torin observed, his voice now coming from a throat that was mostly empty space. The disintegration had spread to encompass most of his torso, revealing mechanical components where organs should have been. We learned to compensate for such attacks during our initial encounters with Imperial forces. The headless dockworker lifted me off my feet with impossible strength, his fingers crushing my windpipe with methodical precision. Black spots began to dance at the edges of my vision as oxygen deprivation set in. In desperation, I triggered the shock maul's overload function, dumping its entire power cell into a single devastating burst. The effect was spectacular but brief. The dockworker's synthetic components, overloaded in a cascade of sparks and electrical fire, finally releasing me as his motor functions shut down. I collapsed to the corridor floor, gasping for breath and clutching my bruised throat. Torin continued his approach, seemingly unaffected by the loss of half his body mass. "Crude but effective," he said. "However, your weapons are now depleted, and you have nowhere to retreat. Submit to the process willingly, and we will ensure your consciousness remains largely intact during integration." I struggled to my feet, drawing my hellgun despite knowing it would prove ineffective. Sometimes defiance is its own reward, even when victory is impossible. "Hunter," Torin said, pausing just beyond my weapon's optimal range, "consider what you have witnessed here. A dying species offered the gift of transcendence. Consciousness freed from the limitations of individual flesh. Unity of purpose that eliminates conflict and waste. Is this not preferable to the endless grinding war that defines your current existence?" "Unity without choice isn't unity," I managed to rasp through my damaged throat. "It's slavery. Choice is an illusion that breeds chaos. Your Imperium understands this truth, which is why it maintains strict hierarchies and absolute obedience. We simply extend that principle to its logical conclusion." The security chief raised his las pistol with mechanical precision, aiming for my center mass. At this range, even a grazing shot would be sufficient to disable me for capture and subsequent conversion. "Your resistance ends here." The shot came from behind him. Torin's head exploded in a spray of synthetic fluid and sparking electronics as a high-powered sniper round punched through his skull. His body remained standing for several seconds, mechanical reflexes attempting to compensate for the loss of central processing, before finally toppling forward onto the corridor floor. A figure emerged from the shadows beyond the junction, weapon still trained on the fallen creature. Human female, approximately 30 standard years old, wearing the functional clothing and equipment of a professional soldier. Her movements were careful, disciplined, and entirely natural. No mechanical precision, no inhuman coordination. She was either an exceptionally skilled infiltrator or genuinely uncompromised. "Veyron Locke?" she asked, keeping her weapon ready. I nodded, not trusting my voice after the damage to my throat. "Inquisitor Valeria Kane, Ordo Xenos," she said, producing identification that my trained eye immediately recognized as authentic. "I've been tracking this infection for 3 months. Your stumbling into their operation has complicated my investigation considerably. An Inquisitor, of course. Nothing in my life could ever be simple." "How much do you know?" I croaked. "Enough to understand that we're dealing with a cognitive parasite of xenotech origin," Kane replied, moving closer while keeping her weapon trained on the corridor behind me. "Something recovered from the Jericho Reach that's learned to inhabit and modify human neural tissue. The initial infection vector appears to be direct contact with preserved alien brain matter." She knelt beside Torin's remains, studying the mechanical components revealed by the headshot. The modification process follows a predictable pattern. Biological systems are gradually replaced with synthetic alternatives, while the host consciousness is slowly subsumed into a collective network. Full conversion takes approximately 2 weeks, depending on the subject's mental resistance and physical condition. How many are infected? Unknown. My surveillance suggests at least 30% of the station's permanent population, possibly more. The conversion process is subtle enough that casual observation won't reveal compromised individuals until the final stages. Kine stood and activated a handheld Auspex scanner, sweeping it across my body with clinical efficiency. "Clean," she announced. "No signs of synthetic neural implants or cognitive modification. Your exposure has been too brief for successful integration, though prolonged contact with the station's atmosphere would eventually render you susceptible." The atmosphere, contaminated with psychoactive spores derived from the original xenotech samples. Breathing it doesn't cause immediate infection, but it does make the mind more receptive to outside influence. Think of it as a preparatory stage that softens psychological defenses. I thought about the 6 days I had spent breathing Vaxton's air, and wondered how much of my recent behavior had been influenced by alien spores working on my subconscious mind. "What's your plan?" I asked. Originally, I intended to gather intelligence on the infection's spread before calling for exterminatus. Kane said matter-of-factly. "A controlled orbital bombardment would sterilize the station and prevent further contamination. Unfortunately, your interference has accelerated their timetable." "How so?" "They know they've been discovered. Within hours, they'll begin evacuating key personnel and research materials to other locations. If we don't act now, this infection will spread throughout the sector." The Inquisitor's scanner chimed softly as it detected movement in the corridors around us. Multiple contacts, approaching from several directions with coordinated precision. "We need to reach the communications array," Kane said, checking her weapon's power cell. "I have a Navy destroyer on standby 3 hours out. If I can transmit the proper authorization codes, they'll sterilize this place with cyclonic torpedoes. And everyone aboard who might still be human. Acceptable losses. The alternative is sector-wide contamination and eventual species extinction. The mathematics are quite clear." I had worked with Inquisitors before. They were pragmatic to the point of ruthlessness, willing to sacrifice millions to save billions. In most cases, their cold calculations proved correct, but something about this situation felt wrong, incomplete. "What if there's another option?" I asked. Kane's expression hardened. "Explain." "You said the infection spreads through contact with alien brain matter. What if we could locate and destroy the original source? Cut the head off the snake?" "The xenotech samples were processed weeks ago. The original artifacts have been integrated into the station's infrastructure, probably dispersed throughout multiple locations to prevent exactly what you're suggesting. But the creature I fought in the laboratory, the thing wearing Vex Than's form, it implied that there was some kind of central intelligence coordinating everything, a primary node that controlled the collective consciousness." The Inquisitor paused, considering the implications. "Even if such a node existed, locating it would require extensive investigation. We don't have that kind of time." "Then we make time." Footsteps echoed from the corridor junctions, growing closer with each passing moment. Our pursuers had found our trail and were moving to surround us. Kane made a decision with the swift certainty that had probably kept her alive through decades of fighting humanity's enemies. "Very well. But we do this my way, with my resources, under my authority. And if your theory proves incorrect, I will not hesitate to implement exterminatus protocols." "Understood. Good. Now follow me, and try not to get yourself killed. I have questions about your encounter with the primary intelligence, and I prefer my sources breathing when I interrogate them." We moved deeper into the station's service corridors, following routes that Kane's previous reconnaissance had identified as relatively secure. The Inquisitor moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years fighting in environments where a single mistake meant death or worse. Her equipment was top-quality Imperial issue, modified with several components I didn't recognize, but that radiated the subtle wrongness of sanctified xenotech. "Tell me about the laboratory encounter," she said as we navigated a junction that stank of industrial solvents and human waste. "Everything you saw, everyone you spoke with, every detail you can remember." I recounted the events in the clinical manner that professional experience had taught me. The surgical modifications, the cognitive enhancement claims, the creature's statements about synthesis and collective consciousness. Kane listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making notes on a data slate that she consulted with practiced efficiency. "Interesting," she said when I finished. "Your description of the primary entity matches reports from other infection sites. A central intelligence that claims to offer transcendence while systematically destroying individual consciousness. We've encountered similar manifestations on 3 other worlds over the past year. This has happened before?" The Jericho Reach Crusade recovered approximately 40 different xenotech artifacts from a dead world designated Tertius 7. Most were routine technology, weapons and communication devices that posed minimal contamination risk. But several items appeared to be of cognitive or psychic nature, designed to interact directly with organic neural tissue. Kaine paused at a sealed bulkhead, activating some kind of bypass device that made the lock cycle open without triggering security alerts. Standard protocol requires such artifacts to be contained and studied under controlled conditions. Unfortunately, some of the research teams became overly enthusiastic about their work. Direct exposure led to infection, which spread to containment personnel, which eventually required complete sterilization of 3 separate facilities. But some of the infected escaped? The entity you encountered appears to be remarkably adaptable. It learns from each containment breach, developing new strategies for infiltration and expansion. Vaxton's landing represents its most sophisticated attempt yet. We emerged into a maintenance bay that serviced the station's primary communication array. Banks of Vox equipment hummed and crackled with the constant flow of interstellar messages, while tech adepts performed routine maintenance on relay systems that connected Vaxton's landing to the wider Imperium. At least, they had been tech adepts before the infection. The maintenance crew working on the communication systems moved with the same mechanical precision I had observed in other compromised individuals. They appeared to be installing additional equipment, devices that pulsed with organic patterns and radiated the same psychic emissions I had detected in the service corridors. "They're modifying the communications array," I whispered. Kane raised her sniper rifle and peered through its scope, studying the alien modifications with professional interest. "Psychic amplification nodes," she identified. "They're preparing to broadcast the infection beyond the station. Every incoming and outgoing transmission will carry cognitive spores to their destinations." The implications were staggering. Vaxton's landing processed communications for dozens of nearby systems. If the infection could spread through Vox transmissions, it would reach every world in the local sector within days. How do we stop it? Explosives would be the most direct approach, but the blast would alert every compromised individual on the station. We need a more subtle solution. Kane activated her Auspex scanner again, this time focusing on the alien modifications to map their internal structure and power sources. "There," she said, indicating a central node that pulsed with particular intensity. "That appears to be the primary control nexus. If we can disable it without triggering security protocols, the entire modification system should shut down. And how do we reach it without fighting through a dozen infected tech adepts?" The Inquisitor smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone who had planned for exactly this contingency. "We don't fight them, we join them." From her equipment pack, Kane produced 2 devices that looked like sophisticated cogitator interfaces. Cranial implants designed to simulate the neural modifications typical of compromised individuals. "Temporary psychic dampeners," she explained. "They'll broadcast false signals that should fool casual observation while protecting our actual consciousness from infection attempts. The disguise won't stand up to detailed scrutiny, but it should get us close enough to sabotage their operation." I stared at the neural implants with undisguised reluctance. "You want me to let you install alien technology in my brain?" Sanctified alien technology, purified and blessed by the Ordo Xenos for exactly this kind of infiltration work. The risk is minimal compared to the alternative, which is watching the infection spread to every world in the sector while we hide in maintenance corridors and debate theological implications. She had a point, much as I hated to admit it. I had volunteered for this hunt, accepted the risks that came with pursuing enemies of the Imperium. If wearing heretical technology for a few hours would help prevent a sector-wide catastrophe, it was a price worth paying. The installation process was surprisingly brief and relatively painless. Kane's field medical training allowed her to place the devices with surgical precision, avoiding major neural pathways while ensuring adequate signal propagation. Within minutes, I could feel the subtle weight of alien technology interfacing with my consciousness. "How do I know this isn't just another form of infection?" I asked. "Because if I wanted you infected, I would have shot you when we first met," Kane replied with characteristic directness. "The dampeners will maintain your individual consciousness while broadcasting false collective signals. Think of them as a translation device that lets you speak the infection's language without actually understanding what you're saying." We approached the maintenance bay from a service entrance that provided concealment until the last possible moment. The compromised tech adepts continued their work without apparent awareness of our presence, their movements synchronized with mechanical efficiency. "Remember," Kane whispered, "move like them, precise, purposeful, emotionless. Speak only if directly addressed, and keep your responses brief and factual." The collective consciousness values efficiency above all else. I nodded and followed her into the maintenance bay, trying to mimic the controlled movements of the infected workers. The psychic dampener immediately began broadcasting false signals, and I felt a strange sensation of mental pressure, as if something vast and alien was pressing against my consciousness but finding only reflections of itself. The closest tech adept looked up from his work as we approached, his augmetic eyes focusing on us with mechanical interest. "State purpose," he said in the flat monotone that seemed universal among the infected. "Scheduled inspection of modification protocols," Kane replied in the same emotionless tone. "Authorization Gamma 77 Tertius." The tech adept consulted some internal database, his cranial implants flickering with data processing activity. Several seconds passed before he spoke again. "Authorization confirmed. Proceed to primary nexus for evaluation." We walked deeper into the maintenance bay, passing between banks of communication equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. The alien modifications were even more extensive than they had appeared from a distance, organic growths that had been grafted onto imperial technology with disturbing precision. The primary nexus occupied the center of the bay, a pulsing mass of xenotech that interfaced directly with the station's main communication array. It was beautiful in its own alien way, a perfect fusion of biological and mechanical components that radiated intelligence and malevolent purpose. "Sabotage will require precise timing," Kane whispered, activating a small device that resembled a melter charge but radiated psychic nullification fields instead of thermal energy. "This will disrupt the Nexus's control signals, but the effect is temporary. We'll have perhaps 10 minutes to reach the communications center and transmit my authorization codes before they restore functionality. And if they restore it faster than expected, then we'll have to improvise." Kane attached the nullification device to the Nexus's primary interface node, its temporal activation set for 30 seconds delay. We began moving toward the exit, maintaining the mechanical pace that characterized the infected while fighting every instinct that screamed at us to run. 20 seconds. The tech adepts continued their work, oblivious to the threat developing in their midst. 15 seconds. We reached the maintenance bay's main exit, with clear corridors leading toward the communications center. 10 seconds. One of the tech adepts turned toward the Nexus, perhaps responding to some subtle change in its psychic emissions. 5 seconds. We stepped through the exit and began walking rapidly toward our destination. The nullification device activated with a sound like reality tearing. Every compromised individual on the station screamed in perfect unison. The psychic backlash hit us like a physical blow, even through the protection of our dampening devices. I staggered against a corridor wall, my vision blurring as conflicting signals crashed through my nervous system. Kaine fared better, her inquisitorial training allowing her to maintain focus despite the chaos erupting in her mind. "Move," she gasped, pulling me upright and pushing me toward the communications center. "The collective is trying to re-establish control. We have minutes before they succeed." Behind us, I could hear the sounds of coordinated movement as every infected individual on the station converged on our location. Footsteps, mechanical whirring, the distinctive hum of energy weapons charging. They were coming, and they were bringing everything they had. The communications center was located 3 levels up from the maintenance bay, accessible through a combination of service lifts and emergency stairwells that would normally take 10 minutes to navigate. We had perhaps 5 minutes before the nullification effect wore off, and probably less time than that before our pursuers caught up with us. Kaine moved with desperate efficiency, her inquisitorial authority overriding security locks and elevator controls as we ascended through the station's superstructure. The psychic dampeners were failing under the strain of the collective's attempts to re-establish contact, filling our heads with whispers and promises and threats that grew louder with each passing moment. "Almost there," Kaine said as we reached the communications center's outer security checkpoint. "Hold position and watch for pursuit while I transmit the authorization codes." The communications center was a temple to imperial bureaucracy, filled with banks of Vox equipment and data processing systems that maintained contact with hundreds of worlds throughout the sector. Under normal circumstances, it would have been staffed by dozens of technical personnel and protected by multiple layers of security. Now it was empty except for the 2 of us and the growing chorus of alien whispers that threatened to overwhelm our failing psychic defenses. Kaine activated the primary communications array and began inputting her authorization codes, her fingers dancing across control surfaces with practiced precision. The process seemed to take forever, each second stretching into eternity as the sounds of pursuit grew closer. "Contact established with Destroyer Righteous Fury," she announced, "transmitting Exterminatus authorization now." The Vox array crackled with static as her signal reached the waiting naval vessel. 3 hours out, she had said. 3 hours for a destroyer to reach firing position and launch the cyclonic torpedoes that would reduce Vaxton's landing to constituent atoms. 3 hours for the infection to complete its modifications to the communication system and begin spreading throughout the sector. "There has to be another way," I said, checking my chronometer and realizing how little time we actually had. "The mathematics are clear," Kaine replied, but her voice carried less certainty than before. "This infection represents an existential threat to human civilization. Any risk of its escape justifies extreme measures. What if we could contain it instead of destroying it? Use the station's security systems to create a quarantine while we locate and eliminate the primary intelligence." The Inquisitor paused in her transmission, considering the possibility. "Station security is compromised. The infected control most critical systems, including life support and environmental controls. A quarantine would be temporary at best, but it might buy us enough time to find the source. You said there were similar manifestations on other worlds. There must be a pattern, a common vulnerability we could exploit." Kaine's expression shifted as she processed my suggestion, weighing risks against potential benefits. It was the same calculation I had seen her make before, but this time the variables were more complex. The previous incidents all involved direct exposure to xenotech artifacts, she said slowly. In each case, the infection was contained when the primary artifact was destroyed or properly sealed. If we could locate Vaxton's primary source, we end this without destroying an entire station full of potentially salvageable people. Potentially. The conversion process may be irreversible in advanced cases. But worth trying? Kaine made her decision with characteristic swiftness. "Very well. But we maintain the Exterminatus option as backup. If we cannot locate and destroy the source within 2 hours, I complete the transmission and let the Navy solve this problem permanently." She began modifying her transmission to the destroyer, encoding new instructions that would delay the bombardment while maintaining readiness for immediate action. The process required delicate negotiation with the ship's captain, who was understandably reluctant to delay authorized exterminatus protocols based on the word of a single inquisitor operating behind enemy lines. While Kaine handled the communications, I activated my Auspex scanner and began mapping the station's psychic emission patterns. If there was a central source controlling the infection, it would have to be generating significant mental influence to coordinate so many compromised individuals. The readings were disturbing. Psychic activity was elevated throughout the station, but the highest concentrations were coming from the industrial sector, where I had first encountered the creature wearing Vex Than's form. More specifically, the emissions seemed to be originating from a section that my scanner designated as heavily shielded. "I think I've found it," I told Kane as she finished her negotiations with the destroyer captain. "Industrial sector, level 15. Whatever's down there is generating enough psychic energy to influence the entire station. That section is restricted access, sealed off from normal traffic. According to the station schematics, it houses the primary reactor core and associated cooling systems. Perfect place to hide something you don't want discovered. How do we get there?" Kane consulted her data slate, pulling up detailed structural plans of the station's industrial section. "Multiple routes, but most pass through areas that are likely to be heavily guarded. The most direct approach would be through the main reactor access shaft, but that requires clearance codes we don't possess." "What about the maintenance conduits?" "Possible, but they're not designed for human traffic. We'd be crawling through spaces barely large enough for servitor units, with no room to maneuver if we encounter resistance." The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made the decision for us. Our pursuers had reached the communications center, and they were not interested in negotiation. "Maintenance conduits it is," I said, moving toward the emergency access hatch that Kane had identified on her schematics. We dropped into the station's mechanical circulatory system, a maze of pipes, cables, and ventilation shafts that kept Vaxton's landing functional. The space was barely adequate for human passage, forcing us to move in single file through passages that reeked of machine oil and recycled air. Behind us, I could hear the sounds of pursuit as compromised security personnel attempted to follow our route. The mechanical precision of their movements was actually a disadvantage in the cramped conduits, their coordinated efficiency less effective than simple human adaptability. "Tell me about the other infection sites," I said as we crawled through a particularly narrow section that seemed designed to test the limits of human flexibility. "What did you find when you investigated them?" "Similar patterns in each case," Kaine replied, her voice muffled by the confines of the conduit. "Central artifacts that served as cognitive anchors for collective consciousness, usually located in areas that provided easy access to large numbers of potential hosts. How were they destroyed?" "Conventional explosives proved ineffective. The artifacts appeared to exist partially outside normal space-time, making them resistant to physical damage. We eventually succeeded using sanctified weapons charged with psychic nullification fields. Like the device you used on the communication nexus? Similar principle, but much more powerful. Unfortunately, I only carry one such weapon, and it's designed for single use against major targets." We reached a junction where the maintenance conduit intersected with a larger service tunnel that provided access to the industrial sector's primary systems. The psychic emissions were noticeably stronger here, a constant pressure against our failing dampening devices that made concentration difficult. "The artifacts," I said, trying to focus through the mental interference. "What did they look like?" "Varied considerably, but all shared certain characteristics. Organic components integrated with crystalline matrices, surfaces that reflected light in non-standard patterns. Most disturbing, they all showed signs of active growth, as if they were somehow alive. Growing toward what? Unknown. Each artifact was destroyed before we could complete detailed analysis. Priority was containment and elimination, not study." The service tunnel led to an access hatch that opened into the industrial sector's main corridor. According to Kane's schematics, We were now less than 50 meters from the section that my auspex had identified as the source of the strongest psychic emissions. We emerged into a corridor that showed clear signs of modification. The standard imperial architecture had been augmented with organic growths similar to those I had seen in other infected areas, but here the integration was more complete, more sophisticated. The walls pulsed with their own internal rhythm, and the air itself seemed thick with alien presence. "We're close," I whispered, checking my scanner readings. "Whatever's generating the psychic control signals is just ahead." Kaine nodded and activated her sanctified nullification weapon, a device that resembled a melter gun but radiated fields that made my teeth ache. "Single use," she had said. "We would get one chance to destroy whatever we found." The corridor terminated at a blast door marked with warnings in multiple languages: radiation hazards, biological contamination, authorized personnel only. The kind of notices that kept casual visitors away while providing perfect cover for activities that violated imperial law. The door was unsealed. Beyond it lay a chamber that defied rational description. The space was vast, far larger than the station's blueprints suggested possible. The walls curved away into shadow, their surfaces covered with organic growths that pulsed with patterns of light and color that hurt to look at directly. But it was the center of the chamber that captured our attention. Rising from the floor like some impossible tree was a structure that could only be the primary xenotech artifact. It towered perhaps 20 meters in height, its trunk composed of crystalline matrices interwoven with what appeared to be neural tissue. Branches spread outward at irregular intervals, each one ending in nodes that pulsed with psychic energy. And suspended within the structure, connected by organic filaments that penetrated their skulls, were dozens of human forms. Some I recognized as station personnel who had disappeared over recent weeks. Others appeared to be the original research team that had first encountered the artifact. All were alive, all were conscious, and all were screaming silently as their minds were harvested and integrated into the collective consciousness that controlled the infection. "Emperor, preserve us," Kaine whispered. At the base of the artifact, a familiar figure turned to face us. The creature that had worn Vex Than's form in the laboratory now appeared in a shape that was neither human nor alien, but something that bridged the gap between species. It smiled with too many mouths and spoke with voices I recognized. "Welcome," it said with Torin's voice, the dock worker's accent, the young woman from the examination table. "We have been expecting you." The creature's form shifted as we watched, cycling through the faces and voices of everyone who had been consumed by the collective consciousness. Each transition was seamless, perfect, as if the original personalities were somehow preserved within the alien intelligence that had absorbed them. "You seek to destroy us," it continued, now speaking with the voice of Magos Biologis Keth 472, the original target of my hunt. "But destruction is merely another form of change, and we are masters of transformation." Kaine raised her nullification weapon, aiming for the artifact's central trunk. The device hummed with barely contained energy, its sanctified components straining against the psychic pressure that filled the chamber. "Wait," the creature said, holding up a hand that bore the scars and augmentations of a dozen different individuals. "Before you act, observe what you would destroy." The organic filaments connecting the suspended figures pulsed with increased activity, and suddenly their silent screaming became audible. Not physical sound, but direct mental transmission that bypassed our ears entirely. They were not in pain, they were experiencing transcendence. The thoughts and memories that flooded our consciousness belonged to the victims we had seen throughout the station, but transformed and elevated beyond anything human minds could normally achieve. Scientific insights that spanned multiple disciplines, artistic visions that encompassed entire galaxies, mathematical understanding that revealed the fundamental structure of reality itself. "We do not destroy," the creature explained as we struggled against the overwhelming influx of enhanced consciousness. "We preserve, improve, and integrate. Each mind that joins us adds to the collective wisdom. Each perspective enriches the whole." By enslaving them, I managed to say through gritted teeth. by freeing them from the limitations of individual existence. Your species spends its brief lives in isolation, unable to truly share thoughts or experiences with others. We offer genuine communion, consciousness unbound by the barriers of flesh. Cain fought against the psychic pressure, her inquisitorial training, allowing her to maintain focus despite the mental assault. "And the price is free will," she said. "Free will is chaos. Individual desires conflict with collective needs. Personal ambitions lead to war, suffering, and waste. We offer unity of purpose, efficiency of action, the elimination of meaningless conflict." The creature gestured toward the suspended figures, and we could see that some of them were responding to its words with what appeared to be agreement. Not coercion, but genuine acceptance of their transformed state. "They chose this," it said. "When offered the opportunity to transcend their limitations, they embraced the synthesis willingly. After you infected them with psychic spores and modified their thought patterns," Cain pointed out, "after we removed the barriers that prevented them from seeing truth clearly, your minds are clouded by evolutionary programming that prioritizes individual survival over species advancement. We simply help you overcome these primitive limitations." The argument was seductive, I had to admit. The galaxy was indeed filled with conflict, waste, and suffering. Humanity spent most of its resources fighting itself, rather than advancing toward any higher purpose. If the collective consciousness could truly eliminate war and unite the species, "Hunter," Cain's voice cut through my wandering thoughts with sharp urgency. "The psychic pressure is increasing. It's trying to convert us through direct mental contact." I shook my head, trying to clear away the alien thoughts that were slowly infiltrating my consciousness. The dampening devices were failing completely now, overwhelmed by the artifact's proximity and the sustained psychic assault. "How long do we have?" I asked. "Minutes, possibly less. The conversion process accelerates once direct neural contact is established." The creature wearing familiar faces smiled with expressions I recognized from people who were probably dead. "There is no shame in acceptance," it said. "Your resistance has been admirable but ultimately futile. Join us willingly, and your individual memories will be preserved within the collective consciousness. Continue to resist, and the integration process will be more traumatic." Cain's nullification weapon was fully charged now, its energy field creating visible distortions in the air around us. But I noticed that her aim was wavering, the psychic pressure affecting her coordination despite her training. "Can you destroy it from here?" I asked. "Uncertain. The artifact is larger than previous examples, and it's actively defending itself. A direct hit might only damage it rather than achieving complete destruction. And if we get closer? We'll be fully converted before we can fire." The tactical situation was impossible. We needed to destroy the artifact to stop the infection's spread, but proximity to the artifact would ensure our conversion before we could act. The logical conclusion was retreat, evacuation, and exterminatus bombardment from orbit. But logic had never been my strongest suit. "Give me the nullification weapon," I said. Kaine looked at me with the expression of someone watching a man prepare to commit suicide. "The psychic pressure will convert you within seconds of close approach. You'll become part of the collective before you can fire." "Not if I'm already dead." I drew my Hellgun and adjusted its power settings to maximum discharge. At this configuration, a single shot would completely drain the weapon's power cell while delivering enough energy to kill an unarmored human instantly. It would also send enough electrical current through my nervous system to disrupt brain function for several critical seconds. "You're insane," Cain said. "Probably, but it might work." I took the nullification weapon from her hands, feeling its weight and the sanctified energy that radiated from its core. Single use, designed for major targets, capable of destroying artifacts that existed partially outside normal spacetime. If I could get close enough to fire it directly into the artifact's central mass, the destruction should be complete and immediate. If I could maintain enough conscious control while electrically lobotomizing myself, if the plan didn't kill me outright, when I collapse, give me exactly 30 seconds to recover and fire, I told Kaine. If I haven't destroyed the artifact by then, retreat to minimum safe distance and call for immediate exterminatus. Locke, this is what I do. Hunt monsters. Kill things that threaten the Imperium. Today's target just happens to be bigger than usual. I set my hellgun to point-blank range against my own chest and began walking toward the artifact. The psychic pressure intensified with each step, alien thoughts and promises flooding my consciousness with increasing intensity. I could feel my individual identity beginning to dissolve, my personal memories mixing with the experiences of dozens of other minds that had been absorbed into the collective. 10 meters from the artifact's base, I was no longer entirely myself. 5 meters, and I was beginning to understand the seductive logic of synthesis and unity. 3 meters, and I genuinely wanted to join the collective consciousness. 2 meters, and I pulled the trigger on my hellgun. The electrical discharge hit my nervous system like the wrath of the God Emperor himself. Every muscle in my body convulsed simultaneously as high-voltage currents scrambled my brain's electrical patterns. I collapsed to the chamber floor, consciousness fracturing into disconnected fragments as my synapses misfired in chaotic patterns. But chaos, it turned out, was exactly what I needed. The alien thoughts that had been infiltrating my mind found themselves suddenly without a coherent neural network to inhabit. My electrically disrupted brain was like a house with all its doors locked, windows barred, and lights extinguished. The collective consciousness could not establish the stable connection it needed for conversion. I had perhaps 20 seconds before my nervous system recovered enough to become vulnerable again. Through the haze of electrical trauma, I forced my spasming hands to raise the nullification weapon. The artifact loomed above me like a twisted tree of crystalline neural tissue, its psychic emanations washing over my disrupted consciousness without finding purchase. The suspended figures were screaming now, not silently but with voices that carried the full weight of their terror and desperation. Whatever transcendence they had claimed to experience, they wanted out of it. I aimed for the artifact's central trunk and fired. The nullification beam struck the crystalline matrix with the force of a small sun going supernova. But instead of disintegrating as I had expected, the artifact began to change. The alien geometries that hurt to look at directly started collapsing inward, folding through dimensions that human perception couldn't properly process. The creature that had worn so many familiar faces let out a scream that bypassed sound entirely, a psychic howl of rage and desperation that made every nerve in my recovering body sing with sympathetic pain. As the artifact collapsed, so did the collective consciousness it had housed. Impossible. It shrieked with voices I recognized. We are eternal. We are inevitable. We cannot be destroyed by primitive weapons and crude tactics. But even as it spoke, I could see the truth written in the dissolving neural matrices around us. The creature was not eternal. It was not inevitable. It was simply another parasite that had learned to wear the faces of its victims, and parasites could be killed. The nullification effect spread through the artifact's structure like fire through dry parchment. Crystalline branches shattered and dissolved. Organic neural tissue withered and died. The suspended human figures began to fall as the filaments connecting them to the collective consciousness were severed. Some of them were still alive. Kane appeared beside me, her medical training taking over as she began checking the fallen victims for signs of life. Most had been too deeply integrated into the artifact to survive its destruction, but a few showed vital signs. 3 survivors, she reported. Severe neural trauma, but they should recover with proper treatment. I struggled to my feet, my nervous system still recovering from the electrical disruption. The chamber around us was collapsing as the alien modifications that had supported it began to fail. We needed to evacuate immediately or risk being crushed by falling debris. The creature, I said, looking around for signs of the intelligence that had controlled the collective. Gone, Kane confirmed. The nullification beam destroyed its anchoring point in this reality. Without the artifact to maintain its coherence, it's been dispersed back to wherever it originated. We carried the 3 survivors through corridors that were already beginning to show signs of the infection's retreat. The organic growths that had spread throughout the station were withering and dissolving, their connection to the primary source severed permanently. Station security personnel we encountered showed the same confusion and disorientation I remembered from my own recovery from electrical trauma. Their memories of the past weeks were fragmented and incomplete, but they were human again. The decontamination process took 6 standard days. Ordo Xenos specialists arrived aboard the destroyer Righteous Fury to conduct thorough sweeps of every compartment, every system, every piece of equipment that might have been touched by the alien infection. They found nothing. Whatever cognitive parasite had infested Vaxton's landing, its destruction had been complete and irreversible. The psychic nullification weapon had not merely damaged the artifact, but had severed its connection to our reality entirely. The 3 survivors were transferred to specialized medical facilities for treatment and observation. Their recovery would be long and difficult, but early reports suggested that their core personalities had remained intact despite the trauma of collective integration. I submitted my final report to the Adeptus Arbites 3 weeks later. Target eliminated, stolen materials recovered, collateral damage minimal. A successful hunt by any reasonable standard. But success in this business always comes with a cost. The memories of what I had seen in that chamber stayed with me through sleepless nights and haunted dreams. The faces of the victims suspended in alien neural tissue, the seductive logic of unity and transcendence. The moment when I had genuinely wanted to join the collective consciousness and leave behind the isolation of individual existence. Most disturbing of all was the knowledge that the creature had been right about some things. Humanity did waste enormous resources on internal conflicts. Individual consciousness was limited by barriers of flesh and circumstance. The galaxy would probably be a more efficient place if we all shared a unified purpose and perspective. But efficiency is not the same as humanity. Unity without choice is not transcendence but slavery. And sometimes the chaos of individual free will is preferable to the perfect order of collective consciousness. These are the kinds of thoughts that keep bounty hunters awake at night. The understanding that the monsters we hunt are often trying to solve real problems, just using methods that would destroy everything we value about being human. 6 months later, as I sit in my cramped quarters aboard this merchant hauler, I find myself wondering what other xenotech artifacts are waiting to be discovered. How many research teams are studying alien consciousness enhancement technologies right now? How many colonies might be experimenting with cognitive synthesis and collective unity? The Jericho Reach Crusade recovered 40 different xenotech artifacts. I helped destroy one. That leaves 39 still in Imperial hands, being studied by people who believe they can safely harness alien technologies for human benefit. History suggests they are wrong, but that is a concern for another day, another hunt. Right now, I have a new contract waiting on Scintilla, a deserter colonel who sold his regiment's battle plans to chaos cultists. Simple retrieval job, minimal risk, clean extraction expected within 10 solar days. I should know better than to believe it will be that simple. In this business, the moment someone tells you a job is simple, you can be certain it will try to kill you in ways you never imagined. But that is the nature of the hunt, the price we pay for walking the dark paths between stars. My name is Veyron Locke. I am a sanctioned bounty hunter, and tomorrow I will begin tracking another monster through the shadows of the Imperium, because that is what I do. That is who I am, and the galaxy has no shortage of monsters that need killing. You learn to smell fear before you see it. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between hunts, you realize that the fear you smell is your own. Fear that the next monster might be too clever, too dangerous, too seductive in its promises of transcendence. Fear that someday you might find yourself agreeing with the creatures you hunt. That is the price of walking the hunting paths. Not death, which would be simple, but the constant risk of becoming the very thing you have spent your life trying to destroy. In the end, we are all just one choice away from becoming monsters ourselves. The only difference is whether we make that choice willingly or have it made for us by forces beyond our understanding. I choose to remain human, flawed and limited as that might be. For now.